Hi everyone. Sorry, recording in progress. Okay. Yep, we're very happy to welcome you back to the Nest webinar series. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Professor Peter Newell. Thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time to contribute to this series. We really appreciate it. So, Peter Newell is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex and co-founder and research director of the Rapid Transition Alliance. His recent research focuses on the political economy of low-carbon energy transitions, but he has undertaken research, advocacy, and consultancy work on different aspects of climate change for over 25 years. He has worked at the universities of Sussex, Oxford, Warwick, and East Anglia in the UK, and Flaxo, Argentina. He sits on the board of directors of Greenpeace UK and has undertaken advisory work for the governments of the UK, Ireland, India, Sweden, and Finland, and for international organisations such as the UN Development Programme, the Global Environment Facility, the Inter-American Development Bank, UNCTAD, and the World Bank. His single and co-authored books include Climate for Change, Governing Climate Change, Globalisation and the Environment, Climate Capitalism, Transnational Climate Change Governance, Global Green Politics, Power Shift, the Global Political Economy of Energy Transitions, and Changing Our Ways, Behaviour Change and the Climate Crisis. So I now give the floor to Peter to present some thoughts on the political economy implications in sustainability transitions. After that, there will be a round of Q&A from the audience, and there's a link in the chat to the live ask. So please submit any of your questions there. And we will also be making some time for people to engage over their camera and microphone afterwards. So please don't be shy and feel free to ask away. Thanks very much. And over to you, Peter.
Great. Thanks very much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be able to speak to you today. Let me try and share my screen. Okay, can you all see that? Yeah. Great. Well, thanks very much. So all I want to do today really is just sort of kick off a conversation or a reflection really about the political economies of sustainability transitions. And I say deliberately political economies because there are multiple ones and different ones coming from different perspectives. And of course, there are multiple ways of thinking about and enacting transitions. So what I'm going to try and do is weave connections between those two areas to see what I think are some of the potential, but also the limitations and challenges of trying to apply political economy ideas and concepts to this broad terrain of sustainability transitions. So what I want to do is firstly say a bit more about why political economy, like why would you think about that as a way into analysing and understanding sustainability transitions, and why now as well? Like what's the particular, why are we having this conversation now, in other words, and what might be the value of political economy tools and concepts and frameworks at this current sort of historical juncture. But then to talk about which political economies, and a lot of the talk will be really just going through different perspectives and ways of thinking about political economy and trying to apply it to sustainability transitions research, and then thinking through a couple of concrete examples what sort of insights it can generate, but then also stepping back and finishing really with just a few reflections on the strengths and limitations. What are some of the challenges going forward in terms of trying to develop or refine more political economy oriented approaches to sustainability transitions. So yeah, why political economy? Why now? I guess it's increasing interest in the governance of socio-technical transitions from a range of scholars over a number of years now, and also I guess you'll have noted in the literature this sort of increasing distinction that people sometimes try to draw between narrower socio-technical transitions, i.e. the reorganization of a particular system of provision, whether it's around food or water or transport or energy, and deeper transformations, which are about trying to challenge the wider systems in which those ways of delivering services exist. And so, I've written on this, but many others have written too, about the difference in those two approaches in terms of their diagnosis of the problem. What is the thing that we are trying to fix as scholars or activists or practitioners in this space? Is it around what I've called in other work a plug and play approach? Is it about moving from conventional petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles, which would be a sort of plug and play type approach. You don't revisit the question of automobility. You don't revisit the question of production and consumption in any broader sense. You just replace one set of technologies or fixes, if you like, with another. Whereas more transformative approaches might be trying to do that. They might be asking those bigger questions about the framing of the issue, the bigger structures within which it exists, and most notably, and I think this is where political economy approaches are particularly helpful, the power relations which surround these things, which need to be attended to. So the assumption, I guess, is that, why political economy? Well, it helps us to understand some of the actors and institutions which are central to any sustainability transition, basically, whether it's government actors, which are often the traditional focus, but also non-state actors, corporate actors, NGOs, cities, a whole range of different actors across different levels. And of course, that's one of the challenges. How do you think meaningfully and conceptualize the linkages and the uneven power relations between those actors? But it really is centering questions of power and politics more than just questions of governance. So this is one of the things I want to sort of emphasize. It's not just about what are the mechanics, the institutions, the spaces in which sustainability transitions are being governed, but it's also about the broader systems of power, social power, politics, and of course those exist within deeply racialized, class-based, gendered structures of power, which I think we also need to be attentive to. But thinking in these terms also, I think, forces us to think about and reflect on our theories of change. What are the assumptions we make about how transitions happen, and also how we might seed deeper transformations? And in a book we did some years ago that on the politics of green transformations, we talked about some of these typologies, if you like, more market-led approaches to the politics of transition, more state-led ones, more technology-led ones, and more citizen-led ones. And each implies potentially a different view of the market, a different view of the state, a different view of civil society, and really what the drivers of change are and who the beneficiaries are of particular transition experiments or attempts at deeper transformation. So a useful thing for me about political economy is it's always asking those questions about, who wins, who loses, how and why. And therefore we're sort of, all of us, I think, engaging in these approaches are forced to think about what's your theory of change and what's that based on? Which examples are you drawing on to articulate that theory of change? Where what historical parallels are there? Why might that theory work in one context or not another? Of course, these are classic social science challenges for people working outside of political economy as well, but I think political economy approaches bring them to the fore. So we are seeing this, growing calls for not just a focus on governance and politics, but political economy specifically in relation to transitions, pathways, transformations. But of course, it's a big field. So if we go back to basics, so classic political economy is really, and here I'm thinking of, Marx, Smith, Ricardo, those sorts of classic political economy thinkers. If you do a course on political economy, those are sorts of people you would be reading. And really, the central questions of political economy as a standalone discipline before it was sort of separated into politics and economics were around questions of wealth. How is wealth generated in society? How is it exchanged? By whom? For whom? And now for me, and the spin I put on it is to ask that question, the one I've posed already, about who wins, who loses, how and why, because that's really the distributional questions. The who wins and loses are fundamental, I think, to political economy. But the how is around the governance and the politics and the mechanisms, and the why is then inviting that sort of theoretical inquiry into why are outcomes skewed towards some actors and interests and technologies and pathways and not others. So it's asking those sorts of questions. And of course, all the classic political economists and variants, i.e. more ecological political economy or the feminist political economy that I've put on there too, the scholarship on feminist political economy and political ecology, which I'll talk about later, they all obviously have a slightly different take on these processes of understanding value and how wealth is generated in society and how it's often unevenly distributed. So it emerges in discussions around cheap nature. So if you think of Patel and Moore's book on the history of the world in 7 cheap things. That's what they're talking about, the way in which things that appear to be cheap are not cheap. They just rely on, racialized, gendered, colonial systems of resource acquisition and distribution. In more classic Marxist terms, it's around surplus value and how that's generated from the relations between labor and capital. And so in those more classical Marxist critical political economy accounts, there's obviously a lot of emphasis on work and labor and class conflict and these sorts of things. And I think those questions are becoming more important again now that there's this big emphasis on just transitions, socially just transitions, and what's the social compact as we try to, quite fundamentally in some cases reorder society. What's the deal in terms of the sort of labour, the sort of jobs that are available, the distribution of gains from alternative pathways, when some of the classic sort of Fordist compromises, if you like, start to break down. And so I think this type of work can be useful for some of those, very live and contemporary transition debates around just transition. But again, critical thinkers will often trying to explore some of the tensions and the contradictions, and I think we see this in numerous different forms, but people like O'Connor or Bellamy Foster, whose book I've mentioned there, talk about the ecological contradictions of capitalism. So not the first contradiction that most Marxists traditionally talk about between capital and labor, where the way in which the ability of labor to use its power and to spend and make money and therefore make capitalists richer is undermined by the ways in which wages are often driven down and conditions are very poor. Well, the second contradiction is about the way in which the capitalist system tends to undermine its ability to reproduce itself ecologically, right? It's diminishing the resource base upon which it ultimately depends to be able to continue generating profits. So there's that sort of dimension that's often drawn out. And of course, more feminist political economy is talking about the huge unstated subsidies effectively that sustain most growth in the economy and underpin a lot of transition experiments as well, namely the care economy and feminized labor and processes of reproduction. So those are sorts of insights that feminist scholars bring to political economy debates, and I think they're important and often neglected in transition debates. And then more sort of critical green or ecological thinking is obviously more critical of industrialism more broadly. So for them, it's not just, as with Marxists, you might argue about the fight over who wins and who loses, and if only things were controlled by the state and distributed differently or centralized, things would be better. But it's a critique of the very goal and purpose of contemporary economies. So that green critique is of industrialism and not just capitalism. It's about that organization of society in a way which is about extracting ever more resources and questioning the sustainability of that very process of wealth creation. And of course, we see that clearly coming through in contemporary critiques of degrowth and green economics, etc. So that's just sort of basic 101 political economy. And I guess where I'm coming from, having sat for much of my career in international relations departments, is international or global political economy. And here, and this was what I tried to do in this book, Power Shift, is try and draw on some of those perspectives and insights, particularly from critical international political economy, to understand transitions, and in particular in this case, energy transitions. And I think the sorts of things that those tools and perspectives are useful for understanding the constraints upon states. So depending on how they're inserted or where they sit within the global political economy, the nature of their trade relations, the nature of their investment relations, that has a big bearing, in my view, on the sorts of transition pathways that they are able to undertake. In other words, how much autonomy they have to chart their own pathways, or how far they're constrained by international capital or by donors or big institutions like the World Bank or the IMF. So it raises those sorts of questions. And, there's different terms and labels that are used to try and understand that. Going back some years, it was often talked about in relation to globalization and the way in which globalization was constraining options and choices and narrowing the policy menu that governments faced. And in more critical scholarship, it's sometimes called disciplinary neoliberalism. So people like Stephen Gill often, use that term to describe the ways in which states are enabled and constrained from doing particular things by the power of finance capital and the ability of companies to relocate their operations elsewhere, etc. And then at a higher level, how they seek to protect and enshrine their rights in global treaties. So think not just the World Trade Organization, but things like the Energy Charter Treaty and so on, where there are conscious attempts to try and ring fence and protect the rights of capital vis-a-vis states. So these are some of the sort of insights that come through from these sorts of perspectives. And then, casting perhaps a slightly more historical angle on all of that is this sense in which we have dominant regimes of accumulation at different periods in history. And at the moment, we're still in this sort of quite finance-led regime of accumulation where things like the Green New Deal or green finance, it's often about how do we mobilize the key motor of innovation and the key driver of change in society, which is seen to be particularly private finance. And so it comes up in the debates around de-risking and mobilizing private finance for sustainability goals of one sort or another. And again, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships are full of that type of discourse and rhetoric. But what I think some of these perspectives help us to do is open up some of these black boxes around the state. What do we mean by the state, the market? Which market are we talking about? Which aspects of civil society? So you can start to excavate and understand a bit more some of the power and social relations that are there and which are really important to try and understand. So global political economy is, I won't go through all of this, but the sorts of insights I think it can helpfully generate for transition scholars like ourselves and people working in this space are around trying to understand the patterns of convergence and divergence in transitions. Why is it certain approaches are being taken or certain policies are seemingly off limits or delegitimized or played down? And I think there is an important role in looking at sort of global institutions and how they do constrain the policy frameworks that are available to governments. And these, I know from talking to many, international institutions at the moment, this is a big debate around poorer countries, wanting to transition. I'm thinking particularly of energy, but wanting to use infant industry protection or subsidies or trade policies of one sort or another to try and actually build up their industrial base and protect themselves and be able to compete in this new global landscape, but are often prevented from doing so because of quite stringent locked-in trade or investment rules. So these are the sort of concrete ways in which some of these ideas and concepts are visible, I think, in sort of in the world of sustainability transitions. I think another thing, and I'm thinking, there's lots of different strands of critical IPE that could be useful here, but my colleague Aminda Bamra talks a lot about the colonial origins of wealth creation. Of course, many scholars are starting to look at how particular transition experiments often relied upon colonial wealth and taxation and labor and so on. So it helps us to sort of locate historically the processes of wealth creation and comparative advantage, which still play out today, again, through some of the mechanisms I was just describing previously around trade investment and so on. Some of those have that legacy of locking in a very uneven playing field, which makes it much harder for poorer countries in particular to compete. And I think that can be usefully added to the more sort of historical institutional analysis that people like Matthew Lockwood and Caroline Kozenko and others have used in trying to understand why particular transition pathways are opened up or locked down. It sort of takes the analysis back further and looks at that process of historical embedding of uneven power relations, and for me, in quite useful ways. And it's it's more attentive, I think, to these deeper power dynamics that run across these arrangements. So it's not just about looking at power relations around one particular governance problem or one particular transition in one particular place, which is often how many of us approach these problems, but it's looking at the deeper thick questions of race or north-south politics and class and gender, and how these configurations of power, which obviously cut across different sites, shed light on what's going on, and the tensions between state and capital, capital and labor, etc. So these are some of the dimensions of power that I think a more political economy account can serve to highlight and help us to analyze. Okay, I'll keep moving in the interest of time. So as an extension of that, one aspect, if you like, of the globalist economy is to think about the global governance of transitions, because increasingly global institutions are governing transitions in more and more direct ways. I mean, I guess they've always been relevant indirectly in terms of sending signals to the market, trying to articulate goals for decarbonisation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or targets around biodiversity or whatever it might be. Protection of water, but increasingly they are in more direct ways. They are directly governing and mobilizing finance, directly, disciplining labor, setting labor standards, trying to support job creation, governing technology in various ways. And some of the institutions I've listed there are examples of bodies that are clearly doing that in ways which impact ever more directly on the process and the conduct and the day-to-day organization of transition. So I think this is an area we need to pay more attention to. We wrote a paper recently trying to look at the global governance of just transitions, which is obviously one area ripe for this type of analysis, but I think it's true of many other areas that we're all working on. And of course, from international relations, which is my sort of background discipline, there are very different views on how we should think about the power of these global institutions, and how much power and autonomy they have in their own rights. In other words, are they more than the sum of the parts? Can they be more than the particular national interests and preferences or geopolitical strategies of dominant powers? So in international relations, people often talk about hegemonic power in terms of the power of the US, or increasingly you might argue China as well, and their ability to shape the scope and the funding and the mandate of institutions. And they use these institutions in ways which advance their own national interests or foreign policy goals. And I think it's a useful way of understanding some of the ways in which they are trying to govern global transitions through these means. So not just through supply chains and broader geopolitical shifts around critical minerals, for example, as you can see in that report there from Irina, but also how states are using their power within global institutions to protect their power, to compete against rivals and to shape the orientation of transitions. And I think what the sort of the global political economy perspective can help us to understand is also the uneven relationship between different bodies. So this Victor and Keohane produced this for climate change, but there are regime complexes on genetic resources, and I think Ben Sovacool may have done one on energy poverty. There's a whole many people have constructed these types of diagrams, but they're useful in trying to look at the connections between different bodies that are operating in particular areas of transitions. And this is one, obviously, for climate change. But you can see, and from this, you can start to map the power relations between particular bodies which have responsibility for some parts of the problem, but also drawing in then financial and trade and other actors, which obviously cast quite a long shadow over in this case the climate regime, but the same would be true of other areas. So that's more sort of the international, the classic political economy, the global political economy. But I think it's also worth picking up on that claim I made around the way in which political economy analysis can help to historicize our understanding of transitions. And some of the literature there that's flagged in those images along the bottom helps to sort of put in longer historical context some of the things that we talk about when we study transitions. So obviously a lot of innovation studies draws on Schumpeter, and then I'm quite influenced by the work of Carlota Perez on technological revolutions and finance capital, and looking at the ways in which finance capital has often been a key historical motor and driver of big shifts in technology and the reorganization of what we would probably call regimes as well in sustainability terms. So taking it back to the Industrial Revolution, and then Fordism and the IT revolution and so on, and trying to understand the power, in this case particularly, of finance capital in driving these things. This is for me very useful historical political economy that I think we should be applying more and more to understanding transitions and what might be going on at the moment. Because of course the speculation is partly, are we now seeing another shift where there'll be another wave of creative or perhaps not so creative destruction, where the power of the fossil fuel regime and the incumbent power is unsettled by restless capital starting to move finance towards more renewable energy of one sort or another. So it allows us to start to try and chart and understand and explore historical parallels that might be useful for understanding contemporary transition dilemmas and experiments. And then beyond that, of course, there's that more sort of sociological history, socio-ecological history. So people like, Jason Moore and others writing about, the production of the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, as he calls it, gives us that more sort of longue durée focus on how particular, landscapes of power have come to be. Okay. And then another strand, another way into sort of drawing on political economy, and this is slightly more focused on governance and institutions. So it's different in a way from the more critical perspectives that I've sort of introduced so far, would be more comparative political economy, which I think is very useful. And many people, again, Matthew Lockwood, my colleague, but others too, looking at the varieties of capitalism framework as a way into understanding transitions. What are the different ways, different state market configurations, if you like, in different parts of the world, and what does that mean for transitions in terms of the ability of the state to coordinate with labor and capital, or the nature of the institutions, and what does that do for our understanding of the pathways that countries pursue, how they're able to pursue them, what they're able to do. And I think one very sort of useful application of this, or of this more sort of comparative approach, is the book by Catherine Hochstetler that's I've got the picture of there, on the political economies of energy transition. But this sort of work, for me at least, can be really useful in understanding the historical institutionalism, the sort of foundations of particular governance structures in particular contexts, processes of rent seeking, the bargaining and negotiations that inevitably attend any shift in dominant regimes. There's always that unsettlement and the revisiting of that big question, maybe, that I asked about who wins, who loses, how and why. Once that's up for grabs, there's a ferocious amount of lobbying and interest group activity to try and shape outcomes, as we always see, like in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, or in Europe around Green New Deal. Is gas in or out? Is it a transition fuel? Is it not? What about blue hydrogen? These battles about which pathways are we going to support and how, always give rise to this sort of rent seeking and lobbying. And of course, there's lots of literature more broadly in political science as much as political economy around interest group politics, business and politics, which I think is useful. I think in transition debates, we tend to reduce all of that to incumbency, but we need to unpack that a bit and draw, and I think, on some of those other literatures which look at the particular strategies and dynamics of power that are used by different groups to try and advance their analysis. And another way in which we can draw in the comparative element, I think, is thinking about questions of policy transfer or social network analysis, where people look at how ideas emergent in particular contexts then get transferred or transplanted to other settings, and that often occurs through global institutions. It comes back to the question I was discussing previously around the global governance of this, that bodies like the World Bank normalize and fund and support and build capacity around particular approaches. So if you think of carbon markets, for example, I mean, they started as a set of experiments in one or two parts of the world, obviously particularly the US, and then that became seen as a model that was desirable and should be rolled out elsewhere. And the World Bank has played a big part in trying to set carbon markets up in various parts of the world. So sort of transferring, diffusing that idea, locking it in, making it conditional on loans that countries receive, etc. So just to sort of give an example of that, this is just, variety, what I'm calling varieties of climate capitalism, but, there clearly are, and we're seeing it around the world today, different visions or understandings of the role of the state. In some contexts, it's a more command and control, centralized approach where you have dominant state-led missions. I'm thinking of like India's solar mission or Kenya's Vision 2030. Different attitudes towards the role of business. So we're in China, quite a limited role for private business, outwardly at least. In other contexts, quite a tight configuration of state and private power, as with the minerals energy complex in South Africa. In some contexts, more tripartite bargaining. think of the Netherlands, Denmark, places like that, where you have established business associations and trade unions. And again, different attitudes towards regulatory ideology. What is the role of state-led regulation as opposed to taxation? Clearly in the US and North America generally, perhaps is more resistance to using taxation as a sort of policy tool and measure than in Europe, for example. So there are those different ideologies which are really important, but I'm sort of clustering that under the notion of different ideas or different views of the state. And of course, different levels of democratization as well are hugely important in understanding transitions, how much civic space is available in different parts of the world to contest transitions, to even dispute the who wins and who loses and how and why. That's obviously a very uneven terrain for many people in many parts of the world. There's a lot of interest in ecological democracy or climate assemblies or citizens assemblies, and of course those will work in some parts of the world, but they won't work in frankly most parts of the world. So we need to be attentive always, I think, to what sort of models or assumptions we're making about the state and the market and the nature of democracy when we're thinking about transitions. And of course, very different levels of integration into the global economy in the ways I was describing earlier. And it's just worth, as a sort of almost an afternote, to say that there's a lot of work, and I'm sure some of you will have come across it, which is much more applied, practical political economy than the sorts of traditions I've been outlining so far. And I've come across this in numerous different settings, with the World Bank and others who very much use what they call a political economy analysis, really to do an institutional mapping or an understanding of where power lies and who is opposing reforms. This is the way I've heard people in those sort of contexts and settings try to draw on what they call political economy analysis. So it's devoid of some of that deeper power relations, certainly devoid of the more historical context I was talking about, and takes a far less critical view, but it's a more applied, practical notion of how do we build coalitions of support for particular sustainability transitions or for particular pathways, who's blocking it, who might be in favour of alternatives, how do we build those coalitions? So there's that type, and some of the reports you can see there on that slide point to that type of approach, which calls itself political economy, and in it on one level is political economy, but it's obviously a slightly different approach to the political economy of transitions than the other perspectives I've been talking about. And then just a sort of quick word on more local forms of political economy, because I'm aware that a lot of what I said is more around the state or the international system. But attention to local political economies or political ecology. And I think, again, the political ecology is something that's quite neglected often. I mean, there have been some useful contributions to understanding sustainability transitions in those terms, but I think there's more value in looking at the particular configurations of power and politics in particular sites, and political ecology, I think, is very good at doing that. Traditionally, from the work of people like Piers Blakey, whose book is there, very useful at looking how particular sites, he wasn't using that language of transition, but in a way that's what he's talking about, are embedded and leveled within this sort of nested system of power relations. So it offers quite a nice way of moving across scales and understanding power relations and how they enable and frustrate possibilities at different sites. And I think political ecology is very good generally at being attentive to some of the sort of class, race, gender dynamics that other accounts of political economy sometimes neglect. So I just wanted to flag that, I think, as another way into thinking about political economy / political ecology. So just to sort of sum up, for me, these types of tools and approaches, and of course they're very eclectic and some of them are in tension with one another, they offer a useful way of understanding why certain pathways get locked in, to use that language, or certain framings are dominant, or certain forms of incumbent power persist in the ways they do, how they become naturalized and fossilized. The ways in which trade-offs, which obviously run through any discussion of sustainability transitions, are made and on whose behalf, I think is, these approaches are useful in trying to identify those and how they come to be. Comprehending the global configurations of power, so partly the geopolitics, which I've touched on a little bit, but the interaction of different, what I've often called material, institutional, discursive forms of power, trying to understand why those interact in the ways that they do to enable and frustrate particular pathways. and trying to unpack notions of incumbent power. And I think, one of the critiques that's often made of political economy, and I'll come on to this in a moment maybe, is that it offers an overly static picture, that it's too attentive to big blocks and structures and not enough to everyday agency or sort of capillaries of power or the contingency of politics. And I think sometimes those critiques are correct. Other times, though, I think of it almost in terms of a microscope, that if you hone in on a particular problem, you can see lots of moving parts and it looks incredibly complex, and there's no way in which you could build general accounts of that. But then when you move out slightly, you can still see these competing blocks of rival actors and coalitions and so on, which also need to be explained and accounted for. So it can't just be down to, well, it's different because these individuals have different interests and these ministries are opposed to these ministries. Therefore, there's no point having an account of the state or of capital or labour. For me, it's about how you hone in and hone out, and recognising the limits of tools and approaches in terms of your ability to do that. So I think, when I won't go through all of this, sometimes in thinking about politics or political economy, people draw a distinction. I've got it sort of 2/3 of the way down that slide, between more critical approaches and more problem-solving approaches. So the latter would be that sort of practical political economy analysis that I was talking about. It sort of takes the existing order as given and then tries to find a way to fix a contemporary particular problem. Critical theory, on the other hand, is always asking those questions about how that order, that way of doing things, came to be in the first place. And so and therefore whether it's in the process of motion and change. So it's always trying to sort of unpick the possibilities of change, often from a normative starting point, that the current order is unsustainable or socially unjust, or often both. And a key thing, I think, in sort of keeping that global picture in view is to look at what David Harvey calls the sort of spatial and temporal fixes. And this is interesting for me in transitions, because transition experiments across sectors and parts of the world are intimately interrelated. They're only possible because of one another. And so the political dynamics by which, governments and corporations pass costs onto other societies. So we try and fix our own sustainability problem around the need for decarbonisation by sourcing critical minerals elsewhere, for example, or we push for biofuels, and therefore the knock-on effect is creating conflicts over land in other parts of the world, etc. So trying to understand these, or we push things into the future through carbon trading or financial instruments of one sort or another. So the politics of how the costs and the gains of transitions are pushed onto different societies within societies, I think can be usefully understood by some of the sort of perspectives I've been talking about today. Particularly, I think, thinking more critically about the state. Obviously, you flagged the flagship journal for this community is EIST. So Phil and I wrote a paper in there about the state and transition, and we were trying to sort of argue for this broader notion of the state, because again, I think sometimes in discussions on the state and transition, we focus on, the entrepreneurial state, we focus on industrial policy, things which are obviously and immediately related to transitions, but perhaps we miss thinking about the welfare state or the military state or foreign policy or the global state, which I think is equally important, and on which I think these perspectives I'm talking about now can help us to understand a bit more clearly. So for me, it's about, are there ways creatively, this is a challenge for all of us, of combining some of the insights from these different strands of political economy work to understand different parts of transitions. And let me just end with one example, because this is from a paper that's about to come out with my colleague Angela Carter, just drawing on some of the strands of work I've talked about today to apply it quite concretely to what I'm calling supply side climate policy. In other words, policies to leave fossil fuels in the ground, namely bans, moratoria, phase out policies, these sorts of things. And thinking about what are the different things you need to be able to explain and which of these tools can help you to do that. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but in terms of the historical origins, why is the energy sector constructed in the way it is? What does that mean in terms of the institutions that have grown up around it and the power they have? Well, historical institutionalism can be useful there. The varieties of capitalism can be useful in there. In terms of the concrete, actually how the policy is formulated, there's going to be conflicts, negotiations between different parts of the state and different fractions of capital. You need to be attentive to the bureaucratic politics and the uneven nature of decision making there, but also the context in which the state is trying to make that decision, and that's where the global governance geopolitics that I was talking about is useful. But then it's also about the durability of policy interventions, right? And that's where it might be about policy feedbacks or about lock-in or about fracturing incumbent power. So again, slightly different set of tools and resources become useful for understanding that. And then how these things spread and globalize would be usefully understood by some of those ideas I was talking about. Policy transfer and diffusion, and of course the geographies of transition. So just to wrap up, sort of limits and concerns. So the classic critiques, as you'll know, probably around political economy approaches, that there's an overemphasis on the material, on the structure, that somehow it downplays individual agency, that political economists, particularly more critical ones, tend to talk about things like capitalism as a system in quite a totalizing way sometimes. And doing so ignores the diversity even within capitalism, as we know from varieties of capitalism, but it also sidelines alternatives and the fact that there are numerous sites of resistance to those things. So in a way, we give too much power, we cede too much power to dominant hegemonic configurations of power in a way that marginalizes perhaps or encourages to overlook sources of resistance. That's one of the sort of classic critiques. Sometimes it's overly attentive to macro and less to the micro and to the local and the sort of political ecology concerns that I was flagging there. Inattentive or negligent around processes of knowledge production. That's often a classic critique from more sort of post-structuralist or postmodern approaches. Underplays contingency, uncertainty, complexity, those sort of in systems, which is often something that has been critiqued. It's a critique that's leveled at many political economy type accounts. Although I would say, and that's that final point there, that political economists are also sometimes accused of exaggerating the possibility of change. They tend to overpredict the imminent likelihood of revolution, even when it often doesn't materialize. So I think, it brings in, just as very last slide now, brings in history, provides us a way of understanding social forces, how to work with and against the grain of predominant incumbent power or dominant regimes, provides a more critical and nuanced view of the state, I would say, can, if done well, disaggregate the role of capital and brings in a more thorough account of global politics. So yeah, questions I think for me and perhaps for all of us, but of course I'm open to any questions, are about how any of you on this call are using political economy in your work and which approaches you're using and why, and whether they help you or hinder you. So those are things that I thought might be interesting for us to discuss, but I'm open to hearing your comments and questions, and thank you very much.
All right, Peter, thanks